time. This is in fact how the brain learns to read. The problem is the fact that it's there, but is it siphoning its way to the different schools of education, schools of psychology, leadership, all of these silos within the educational system as a whole? Are they getting access to this information?
It's a bizarre thing that I still cannot wrap my head around as to why the people who have made these discoveries have not been able to transform that into practice. Evidence-based and evidence-aligned instruction is instruction that is based on or aligned with what the science of reading has found to be simply most beneficial, most effective for the most students.
It's a hands-on type approach. It's not just worksheets. We know that we need more phonological awareness and we need all of these other components. But it needs to be tailored at a point where it's explicit and systematic. None of it's left to chance.
Districts, policies, standards. How was I, as one person, ever going to be able to impact that? I just had the idea that, wait, if we gather people who have knowledge and expertise in multiple areas, kind of that network, I think that's what creates a successful social movement.
So we came together and realized that we have really lived experiences and we don't just walk the walk, we can talk the talk.
Good evening, everybody. Hello. Welcome to the Virginia, the Reading League Virginia chapter event tonight. We're glad you're here. I know it's been a long day for so many of you. So thank you for taking the time to be a part of our evening. Just want to remind you or let you know, share with you who our board members are. I didn't introduce myself, so I'll do that now. My name is Kim Bowson Brown, and I am the president of the Reading League Virginia chapter. And listed on this slide are the other wonderful board members that are currently serving you in the state of Virginia through this chapter. We're going to share with you our mission and vision just to give you an idea of that and what we stand for. Our vision at the Reading League Virginia is that every educator is prepared to implement evidence-based practices to meet the diverse profiles of all students with the goal of becoming skilled lifelong readers. And then our mission includes educating every administrator, teacher, and parent to the research and evidence that has emerged from the science of reading, promoting an understanding of how evidence-based informs classroom practice, supporting educators to implement evidence-based practices, bringing together all stakeholders to with shared missions around reading, fostering equitable access to evidence-based reading services. So our vision and mission we hold dear to us. We are glad you're here. Our membership is growing. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Susan, who is going to introduce our speaker for tonight.
Thank you, Kim, and welcome to everyone. We are more than pleased to have with us here tonight Dr. Colby Hall, Assistant Professor of Education at the University of Virginia. Dr. Hall's research focuses on the components of effective literacy instruction for elementary and middle school students with or at risk for literacy learning difficulties, inference instruction as a means of improving reading comprehension, reading instruction for bilingual and multilingual students with reading difficulties, instruction supporting text comprehension in content area classrooms, and technology delivered reading instruction. Dr. Hall is currently working on 2 projects, one aimed to further the development and pilot of reading rules for kindergarten small group literacy intervention program, and the other to provide school leaders with web-based coaching and professional development tools to support teachers of students with disabilities in delivering evidence-based academic vocabulary instruction. Dr. Hall has also authored many peer-reviewed publications. We are thrilled to have her with us this evening to discuss adolescence and liberty. So welcome, Dr. Hall.
And Dr. Hall, I believe you have a presentation to share.
Yes, and I am going to share my screen. 1 second. Hopefully all of you will be able to see. Can you see it right now?
Yes, with your
Yes.
notes.
Okay. Now, does it work better?
We're still seeing you in presentation style, so we see your notes instead of just the slideshow.
Got it. Let me try it again. Let me maybe unshare and share again. Okay, so we just want this desktop. Can you now see the notes?
Yes,
Yep,
all
perfect.
good.
Perfect.
Okay, great. I'm so glad to be here and to talk with all of you. I feel like I'm sort of preaching to the choir, and I don't know how much of what I'm going to say today will really be news to anyone. But I'm eager to present some things and to hear what you all think. I think the discussion afterwards will be really interesting. So what I'm going to focus on today in particular is the way that we can build language comprehension to support reading comprehension for students in grades 4 through 8. And I found it was really hard to choose what I wanted to talk about to fill this 40 minutes because there's so much here when it comes to building language comprehension to support reading comprehension. I know I spoke with Tisha yesterday, and she asked, what articles, what readings might sort of align with what I plan to present today. And I gave her an article that I wrote with Marcia Barnes a few years ago, maybe more than a few years ago now, on inference instruction to support reading comprehension. And then I realized that today I'm not really talking about that at all, but I am really interested in that topic too. So if anyone's interested in talking about that, during the discussion portion, let me know. Okay, so just to start with some definitions, if we're talking about language comprehension instruction to support reading comprehension, first we should define reading comprehension. So there are a lot of different definitions of reading comprehension out there, but generally folks agree that it's one of the most complex and uniquely human of cognitive activities. And it's really complex. It's comparable to the performance of a symphony orchestra. It's a process that requires the orchestration of many different cognitive skills and abilities as the reader constructs a coherent mental model to make sense of the words and sentences of the text. Sort of a simpler way of thinking about it is thinking guided by print. And then the Rand Reading Study Group has defined it as the process of simultaneously extracting and constructing meaning through interaction and involvement with written language. Dan Willingham has a kind of neat and simple definition as a three-step process. It's extracting ideas from sentences, connecting these ideas to one another, and then building some more general idea of what the text is about. And it's also important to know that it's a process that's really unique to three different things. It's unique to each reader who's doing the comprehending, and we bring to the text a particular set of abilities and knowledge and experiences and motivation. And it's also unique to the text, which may be more or less complex syntactically, or complex in terms of the vocabulary words that it includes. And it can be about any number of different topics. And you'll note that sometimes the topic of the text matches the reader's experiences, and sometimes it's less well matched to the reader's experiences. And then it's also unique to the activity in which comprehension is a part. So if we're reading maybe a newspaper article just to entertain ourselves in the morning while we're drinking a cup of coffee and waiting for the caffeine to sink in, that's a different experience than if we're reading an article and we know we're going to need to summarize the most important parts for a class later that day. So that's a really important thing to take into account when you're defining reading comprehension too. And then I think that Scarborough's reading rope is also useful when defining reading comprehension because, even though it's clearly a process, people often say, reading comprehension is a process, not a product. But in the simple view of reading comprehension is the product term. It's the product of both of those two factors, word recognition and language comprehension. And it is really important to recognize that all of these strands play a role in reading comprehension, the word recognition strands, as well as the language comprehension strands. And then I also think, I know that, one of the things that I was responsible for today was kind of speaking to adolescents and how to support literacy development for adolescents. And so it's really important to recognize that there's reading comprehension is more dependent on these language comprehension ingredients of the reading rope as kids get older, partially because in typically developing students, they reach a point in decoding where most students are proficient word readers and there's not a whole lot of variability in word reading. So that doesn't predict reading comprehension to the same degree. I will say that for students who struggle with word reading does still contribute significantly to reading comprehension, even when kids get older. But also, texts just get a whole lot more complex as students get older. So it requires more in the way of, I don't know if you can see my cursor here, but more in the way of background knowledge and vocabulary knowledge. They have to, disentangle and identify the meaning of very complex sentences syntactically. And they have to make more connections, integrate information across larger distances in text. So language comprehension does become really, really important as students get older. At the same time, before I really jump into the language comprehension piece, I do want to acknowledge that among students with reading comprehension difficulties, not that many of them have specific reading comprehension difficulties, meaning difficulties in reading comprehension or language comprehension in the absence of word recognition or fluency, word reading fluency difficulties. So this slide here is a study with third graders. So, we're not yet talking about adolescents, but I'll show you next a slide that shows that this applies to 8th graders too. But this sample of third graders were students who failed the state reading test at the end of the year. And they measured word recognition, reading rate, and comprehension in these students. And they found that about 15% of the students who failed the state reading test had reading comprehension difficulties in the absence of difficulties with word recognition and reading rate. So 15 in every 100 students who failed the state reading test had specific comprehension difficulties, which would mean about like 2 or 3 of every 100 kids if you looked at all kids, right? So it is worth knowing, and then I'll show you this slide too, which is another study that was done with 8th graders who failed. In this case, it was the Texas state reading test, and 12%, 12 out of every 100 students who failed that test had difficulties in comprehension without also having difficulties with decoding or reading fluency. So I think it's worth recognizing that for many of the students that we're going to be supporting in terms of their language comprehension, in order to help them improve reading comprehension, for many of those students, we will also need to work on reading rate, word reading accuracy. So yeah, just worth acknowledging that. All right, but now that we have decided to jump into the language comprehension strands, and well, maybe I should jump back and say this question about can reading comprehension be taught is really important, because we've talked about the fact that it's really sort of a product of all of these other strands. And so shouldn't you just teach these other strands instead of trying to teach reading comprehension? And this has been the topic of some controversy over the last decade or more. And these headlines here on this slide, I think, convey some of the controversy. You can see that in the Dan Willingham and Gail Lovett article, they're sort of suggesting that reading comprehension strategy instruction is a bag of tricks, right? It might work quickly, but it doesn't really improve general reading comprehension. And then Natalie Wexler in The Knowledge Gap, which was published in 2019, really her main argument is that we should spend less time teaching kids reading comprehension strategies, right? And focus more on building their knowledge. So this question, can reading comprehension be taught, is an important one to try to answer. And I think I don't disagree with Dan Willingham or with Natalie Wexler. I do think that we've often overdone it when it comes to reading comprehension strategy instruction, focusing so much on kind of the execution of the strategy and not on learning from text and the content in the text. So I think I just want to acknowledge that. I also want to note that right now, and sometimes it's hard to know the order in which to present all of my ideas, but I think what we're focusing on for reading comprehension instruction is these aspects of language comprehension, maybe also some strategies, that arrow that says increasingly strategic there refers to the way in which sometimes students do need to be metacognitive and monitor their comprehension and know how to strategically repair their comprehension when comprehension breaks down. But primarily, building knowledge, building background knowledge and vocabulary knowledge is kind of the name of the game when it comes to improving reading comprehension. And then also helping students engage in learning and practice around verbal reasoning and language structures and literacy knowledge, including knowledge of text structure in a way that can improve reading comprehension. So I thought I would start maybe with the background knowledge and vocabulary instruction piece, which is obviously really important. I could, writers very frequently assume that the reader has a certain amount of vocabulary and background knowledge. And this is not a book for adolescents. This is a picture book, but I thought it was a good example. The writer assumes that the readers of this book, which is a little excerpt from the book Wolfie the Bunny, know that wolves are natural predators of bunnies, right, of rabbits. And that's why Dot is so frightened. That's why she's saying he's going to eat us all up on this page, right? And then later on in the book, the reader should also know that rabbits are not natural predators of bears. And that's what makes Dot's bravery on this page, so surprising. That's sort of the punchline of this page, right? So the reader assumes this knowledge, and it's really important that students have this knowledge in order to make the inferences that are important to make while they're reading this book. And you can't teach students to make these kinds of inferences unless they have the requisite knowledge. I will also say, before I kind of move on to how to explicitly teach vocabulary knowledge, that vocabulary and background knowledge are really similar constructs. There's been a fair amount of research that has shown that when you measure those two things, they are so highly correlated that they're kind of indistinguishable. So I just wanted to demonstrate this by talking about the definition of the word moon. If you really understand what moon means, right? That if you understand what it means to satellite the Earth, that it means, to orbit the Earth, and that's what moons do. And if you understand, the relationship between the moon and Earth and the sun, then you really know more than vocabulary knowledge, right? You have some background knowledge about, the solar system and even you have to know what's different between the moon and stars. And this is true of so many different words, right? Once you have a fair amount of vocabulary knowledge, you have background knowledge too. So I wanted to make that clear. And then I wanted to ask you quickly, I know we can't discuss this out loud, but just think, what did vocabulary instruction look like for you when you were in elementary or middle school? And I think for a lot of us, vocabulary instruction looked like copying definitions down from a dictionary. Maybe it's not true for you. Maybe you had, rich vocabulary instruction that gave you lots of opportunities to engage in practice and using words and hearing words used in context. But when I ask that question, usually people tell me that they looked up the definitions of words in the glossaries of their textbook and they copied it down into a notebook. And the problem with that, and this is another image from or I don't know if I showed you the first one, but this is from Dan Willingham's great book called The Reading Mind. And he kind of shows you that the way that we store word meanings in our brains is not as dictionary definitions and not even as lists of attributes like in the image at the top. So we don't really store word meanings as those like watermelon, edible, juicy, inside, red. That's not how we store information about word meanings. Instead, it looks something more like that image at the bottom of the page where there are words in those nodes, and then all of the nodes are connected. This sort of vast interconnected web of semantic information. And in this web, we don't just have kind of the attributes of words, but we also learn about words that come before or after a given target word. So we might, in our word web, we might have milk associated with spill. We might have oil associated with spill. We would definitely, in our word web, have information about spills usually being an accident. And we would store information about the fact that they can be problematic, both either because they make a mess or because, like in the case of hot coffee, maybe they cause an injury. We also learn that even though the third definition of that word spill is to move or spread out into a wider place or area, that you wouldn't talk about a crowd spilling out, or that you would talk about a crowd a crowd spilling out onto the street, but you wouldn't talk about spilling peanut butter over the surface of a slice of bread. And similarly, you would not ask this question, will you spill water on my plants for the month of June while I'm on vacation? And we usually learn this not by, say, memorizing when a word is used as a transitive verb or not, but just by having lots of opportunities to hear words like the word spill used in context, reading them in context, listening to them in context. And we gradually sort of accumulate this nuanced understanding of a word's meaning. And that's important to know because when we engage in vocabulary instruction, we're definitely going to be introducing word definitions. You kind of can't get around giving students friendly definitions for words. But the most important part of vocabulary instruction will be giving students lots of examples and non-examples maybe, and opportunities to hear and see words used in different contexts. And that will be kind of the most important part. So I just wanted to talk about the steps. First step is just choosing your words. And some studies suggest that it's effective to teach about 4 words per week for students with learning difficulties. In some studies conducted by Beck and others, they taught middle schoolers up to 12 words per week effectively, so somewhere between 4 and 12 words. And you'll want to differentiate between tier 2 academic vocabulary words and tier 3 type discipline specific words. And you'll want to teach both, but you'll know that you'll kind of get the most bang for your buck with these tier 2 words that appear across content areas. I think I'll skip that because I have so much to cover in so little time. I need to go more quickly. Then you'll pronounce the word and facilitate student pronunciation practice, providing corrective feedback and giving students opportunities to pronounce the word again if there are errors. So I'd say, today we're going to learn about the word erosion. What word are we going to learn about? Then I would provide my concise and student-friendly definition. And if I have multilingual students in my classroom, and if I feel comfortable speaking the language that is their native language, I can provide a translation, and also provide other guidance in making cross-linguistic connections. I'll talk a little bit later about morphology, but it can be really productive to teach Romance language speaking students Latin roots, which have Romance language friends kind of, and that can help them access lots of cognates in their native language. Then I would give my student-friendly definition. I would say erosion is a process that gradually wears something away. And then I would provide a few visual images that convey important information about the word's meaning. So I've already given you, this visual image, but I'd want to say something about it, right? I'd want to say, in this picture, this rock has been eroded or worn away by the water, creating a hole. This erosion took thousands of years, meaning it took thousands of years for the water to erode or carve out and wear away the rock. And then I'd want to provide lots of visual images, and hopefully by looking at lots of visual images, students will kind of like pick out the salient features of all of these images. So I'd say this is a picture of coastal erosion or beach erosion, which happens when waves and currents remove sand from the beach. You can see how the water has kind of pulled some of the sand from the coast toward the ocean, gradually carving away more and more of that person's backyard. And you can actually see that people have even put up a fence to try to prevent erosion here. And I could show more visual images, and I could also talk about the figurative meanings of the word, the way that people sometimes talk about the erosion of people's trust in Congress or the news media or something like that, or maybe like how a child can have their trust their trust in their parents eroded when their parents make a bad decision or something. Then you're going to provide synonyms or antonyms. And I actually think the most important thing to provide students with are collocations, which I can talk about in a second, and also talk about the word's morphology. So when I say collocations, I'm talking about word pairs. So words that frequently appear before or after the target word. And in this image, if you're teaching the target word radiant, all of the words that are attached by lines are collocations, right? The words that are circled are synonyms for the word radiant, but the words that are attached with those lines are words that I think always come after the word radiant. So you frequently talk about someone having radiant skin, you talk about a radiant smile, you talk about, it's interesting how frequently radiant is used to describe skin or complexion, or, as well as being used to describe light and heat. So that can be so useful for students. And I have lots of other examples of that, but when a student knows that the word bulging, for example, is frequently used to describe muscles, but also a wallet. There's a vocabulary instruction program called Mrs. Wordsmith, and they provide students with a lot of collocations. And I'm always so surprised to learn Vacant, for example, is very frequently associated with people's gaze, like a vacant look or a vacant stare, but also, it's used with vacant lot or vacant, it's just so interesting to learn what statistically common word pairs are, and it really empowers students to use these words in their writing more easily when they know what pairs to use, not just the meaning of a single word. Okay, so I would teach them these collocations, as well as teaching them synonyms and antonyms if possible. For erosion, our synonyms would be something maybe like gradual wearing away, gradual destruction, gradual washing away, all of these. And then I would, try to provide some antonyms too. And there are two different categories of antonyms that I could think of when it came to erosion. There's an antonym that is kind of like the direct opposite, right? The opposite of erosion is building up or strengthening or increase. But then there's also a second set of antonyms that are sort of like, instead of something happening gradually, destruction happens suddenly, sudden destruction, sudden decrease. So that might be helpful for students to learn. And then I would want to talk a little bit about morphology and about the fact that the ION, suffix converts that verb erode into a noun. And, I would talk about the fact that wind and waves eroded the rock, but the process or the product of this is erosion, and just sort of talk about these words and how they're all related. And then the most important thing that I will do is provide 1 to 3 example sentences in which the word's context demonstrates something about its meaning. So, I'll give these example sentences. And I may also want to give some non-example sentences. And you need to be a little bit careful about non-examples with students who have learning difficulties, because sometimes the wrong usage can sort of stick in students' minds. And so it can be a bad idea. So if you're worried at all that might happen, just stick with the example sentences. And the most important thing to do when you're looking at these example and non-example sentences is to talk about why. Why would you not say the building suddenly eroded during the big storm? Why would you not say that I bought a car yesterday which created a massive erosion of my bank account? So the why part of that discussion is really, really important. And then I think this is the last step. You provide practice opportunities that allow students to apply their new word knowledge. You can do receptive language activities where students are just giving like a thumbs up or thumbs down or a clap if. You can then move on from these receptive language activities to expressive language activities where they're using the word expressively in oral language, and then finally where they're using the word in written language. And this is often the most challenging thing for students to do. So you can scaffold these written language activities so that maybe students just start by filling in the blank. Maybe you give them sentence stems and they figure out how to incorporate the word in the ending of the sentence. And then they can, write a sentence on their own that they compose themselves. So an example of a clap if activity would be, I would ask you, clap if you'd be happy if there were a high level of erosion impacting your favorite trail. And hopefully we wouldn't hear any clapping and we could talk about why we would not be happy, right? I might ask you, does this represent erosion? Thumbs up or thumbs down? And then we could talk about why, right? I do find all of these opportunities just increasing student opportunities to respond is of course the name of the game. And then also I find providing a lot of visual images and asking students to kind of grapple with and identify the salient parts of these visual images and the way that they do or don't represent the word's meaning can be really, really productive. So erosion, thumbs up or thumbs down, then we talk about why, and then I might give them a tricky image. And I might say, okay, so thumbs up, thumbs down here, is this erosion? And this is sort of tricky, right? Because you see that, that rocky hill that was carved out clearly to make the road. And I guess possibly there's been erosion over time. You can see that there's water on the road, and we know like water is often a cause of erosion. So maybe someone could defend a thumbs up here. And then maybe someone could also defend a thumbs down. And so there might be an interesting conversation as a result of this question. And then you might ask students to turn and talk with each other about some things that cause erosion. And then you'd maybe get into, it's not just wind and water, but ice can cause erosion. There's human impact can cause erosion, like taking shortcuts off the main trail. Maybe there are chemicals that can cause erosion. So there can be a really productive conversation here. And then graphic organizers can be really helpful for students during vocabulary instruction. So I recommend this as an evidence-based practice too. Okay, so I won't even review all of these steps because I can always share this with you later. I wanted to share this resource. This is a colleague of mine at UVA, Michael Kennedy, but he on this website, and I believe this website may be under renovation, and so I'm sure it will be even better once that's finished, but he has so many resources available for vocabulary instruction in content area classrooms. And they're just like each link that you click on is a PowerPoint filled with lots of visual images that help you teach different vocabulary word meanings. So I highly recommend that. And then one thing that I don't have time to talk about other ways to build knowledge, but one way, really productive way to build knowledge is by having text sets and kind of intentionally building students' knowledge by using texts on overlapping topics. And this is a way to gradually build knowledge and simultaneously scaffold students' reading of more complex grade level texts. So you can start them off, reading an easier text on a given topic. And then once they have some knowledge, they'll be empowered to read a slightly more complex text on another topic that, increases their knowledge, gives them even more knowledge related to that topic. And, little by little, you can, because knowledge is so, is the name of the game, right? When you have knowledge, I wish I could share, I think it's part of a study that Dan Willingham often cites in his presentations, but I think it's the baseball study where, and I'm sure all of you have heard of this study, but they compare students who are supposed to be proficient readers with students who are supposed to be struggling readers. Some of the proficient readers have a lot of knowledge of baseball, some of them don't. Some of the students who are supposed to be struggling readers have a lot of knowledge of baseball, some of them don't. But the students who are supposed to be less proficient or struggling readers with a lot of baseball knowledge perform better than the students who are supposed to be proficient readers with not a lot of knowledge of baseball when they're reading texts about baseball, right? So yeah, I just wanted to sort of plug this article so that if anyone wants to learn more about building background knowledge through reading. Okay, so quick summary, reading comprehension instruction should prioritize building knowledge. This might look like building vocabulary or world knowledge before and during reading, reading content-rich texts that build on or connect to each other through these sorts of text sets, and communicating to students that learning content is important, right? The goal is to learn, not just to execute a strategy effectively. But then I think the question is, besides building knowledge, if we all acknowledge that building knowledge is really, really important and maybe the most important thing, besides that, what should reading comprehension instruction look like? And I haven't given myself much time to talk about this next question. And I should say, I think I was told that I speak for 40 minutes, but you all should interrupt me if I'm supposed to stop earlier than that. or tell me if I'm supposed to speak for longer than that. So I think I'm going to skip some of this historical context and just skip to this slide. There are sort of two routes that you can go when it comes to reading comprehension instruction beyond building knowledge. And I planned to talk briefly about each one, but I think I'll just do a real quick review of sort of what a text-based approach looks like. And then I can come back later and talk about strategies-based approaches if anyone is interested. I am a big fan of text-based approaches. And it's interesting because a lot of people talk about inference instruction as though it's like focusing on a skill, right? On inference skill, and it's skills-based, and it's, the opposite of sort of it's the epitome of a reading comprehension strategy-based approach. But the way that I like to teach students to make inferences more effectively is actually more text-based. And it's focusing on the content of specific texts, but just giving students lots of opportunities to engage in inferential reasoning while reading. McCune and Beck and Sharon Vaughn, who I worked with at UT Austin, she was my advisor and my supervisor for my postdoctoral work, have done a lot of work demonstrating the effectiveness of text-based approaches to reading comprehension instruction. And they're really pretty simple. So in a text-based approach, students are taught to focus on the content of a specific text, building a representation of the ideas in that text through discussion. And the focus is on the ideas in that specific text, not on the mental processes that students are using to understand them. So one feature, one thing that's usually that text-based approaches usually have in common are that there's sort of a big question or a comprehension purpose question, or in Sharon Vaughn's work, it's called a comprehension canopy in her PACT, Promoting Adolescents' Comprehension of Text work. She calls it a comprehension canopy. And it is supposed to sort of focus students thinking about the text. And then during reading, the teacher or the students ask meaning-focused questions. The teacher usually intentionally chooses stopping points in the text where something important happens, an inference needs to be generated to ensure comprehension. And the questions can be sort of text-specific, or they can be as simple as, what's going on here? Let's stop and just talk for a sec. What's going on here? Or, okay, so wait, how does this connect with what we just read? So for a text like this one, earthquakes trembling under Mount St. Helens, but many are too small to feel, the steps using a text-based approach would be to introduce the text and very quickly build background knowledge. It might be as simple as just saying we're going to read an article called, giving them the article name, and saying Mount St. Helens is a volcano in the state of Washington. That may be all the background knowledge building that they need. Or you could maybe show them these quick videos about volcanoes and earthquakes, because the text is both about earthquakes and volcanoes, if you think that they may need a little bit more background knowledge building in order to understand the text. Then you're going to introduce your comprehension purpose question, something like, as you read, I want you to think about this question. Are earthquakes a reliable indicator of an upcoming volcanic eruption? Or like maybe another way to ask the question is, should we be worried when there are little earthquakes under a volcano? Are they a sure sign that it's going to erupt? As you read, make sure to collect evidence you can use to support your answer. Then I would plan these stopping points where I had sort of text-specific questions that I wanted to ask. And at each stopping point, I would stop and I would ask the questions. Maybe the first questions that I'd ask would be more basic, literal, explicit questions. And then I would move on to some more implicit, inferential questions. And then after we'd finished reading the text, I would return to my comprehension purpose question. I would ask students to answer and provide text evidence for their answers, and we could discuss and debate and make sure that we really referred back to the text to support whatever answers we were giving. And sometimes I think the trickiest thing about text-based approaches are just how to structure the work. Sometimes with like a collaborative strategic reading, let's say strategy-based approach, it's so nice because there's so much structure that teachers have a real vision for how, for exactly what students are supposed to be doing in their groups, and each person has a role. But you can structure text-based discussions too, using in Sharon Bond's PACT work, they use this team-based learning structure, where students discuss and debate their answers, and they scratch off their answers on answer sheets. But having small group work be part of the structure, making sure to fold in teacher modeling, both related to how to talk in small groups and related to the thinking and the integration, the text integration work that students are doing. And then also making sure that there are some sorts of accountability structures, whether it is the sort of scratch off answer sheet, or having students check off what they're doing as they're doing it in a discussion, or maybe they can record themselves and they can choose, they can have a little portfolio of like good snippets of conversation that they have in their groups. And I know I should stop now, but I think actually I just had a couple more slides focused on text-based discussion, so I can just finish super quickly. Text-based comprehension is less explicit maybe than strategy instruction. There aren't these kinds of explicit explanation, demonstration, modeling steps that often happen when teachers are modeling how to carry out a strategy. But you can fold explicit instruction into scaffolding and feedback when you're circulating around the room and providing feedback to students in their groups. So that's important to know too. Good comprehension purpose question. Feel like we can just stop there. But the quality of the comprehension purpose question is important, or the comprehension canopy question is important in text-based instruction. And one of the most important things is just that it should be able to be answered using text evidence, and ideally it should be able, students should be able to answer it in lots of different ways. Okay, so I think that's all. I'll stop sharing so that we can all talk. And I realize I haven't been looking at the chat at all, so I'm sorry if I've missed all of these comments. And you all should just, yeah.
I think, Colby, I scanned too. I don't think that we have any questions, but if anyone does, they can post that in the chat. I'm scanning to see if I missed any questions. Colby, could you give us a teaser? I mean, because I feel like you have a few extra minutes. So I'm sorry that, that if you felt like we were rushing you through, I know how much great information you have, but what about a teaser about inference instruction as a means of improving reading comprehension, or a teaser, because I know we don't have a lot of time, so that's why I'm using the word teaser, or a teaser about instruction, supporting text comprehension in the content areas as well. If you want to give us a teaser or some direction on what to look to get some more information.
I think maybe one of the most important things that I like to communicate about inference instruction is that you really can first of all, there's literal comprehension and inferential comprehension. And inferential comprehension is everything that is not literal comprehension, basically. So it's everything we're doing all the time in order to generate a main idea statement, or write a summary. There's so much synthesis and integration of information in text that's going on, and all of that is inferential thinking. So in some ways, it is such a big category that it is a little bit unwieldy to talk about. And I think sometimes we tend to think about like inference as this like very narrow skill that you can teach easily using a particular strategy. But it really isn't that way. And so that's why kind of a strategy-based approach to inference instruction is difficult, especially when you think about inference encompassing these kinds of text-based categories like pronoun reference inferences, when you're trying to teach students that this, or to ask themselves this, like, what does this refer to? That's an inference type, and a really important inference type, actually, the pronoun resolution inference type that we really need to teach students to work on. But there's so many different types of inferences, right? And so I think it can be useful sometimes to alert students to different inference types. I have done that in my work, and I don't think it's been a bad thing. But often what I'm doing is I am using this sort of a text-based approach where I'm embedding inference questions. During reading, I'm making sure to stop and ask students inference questions and give them opportunities to engage in inferential thinking, and then scaffolding their text integration. But I'm not kind of teaching them how to use a strategy to do it. I'm just giving them opportunities to practice that sort of verbal reasoning in a way that I hope transfers to future texts. So I don't know if that helps, but I think it is. One day, I think maybe in the article that I shared, I talk about different inference types, and I think that maybe is useful. I think another interesting thing that I find that often in classrooms, we focus on teaching students to make predictions. And one really interesting feature of the research on inference generation is that good readers very rarely make predictive inferences as they're reading. If anything, we may make like a very vague sort of a prediction that like, oh, something bad is going to happen, or something like that. But very rarely do we stop ourselves and like make a specific prediction about what is going to happen next. And so stopping students and asking them to do that may not actually be asking them to engage in like a practice that we want to become habitual, if that makes sense. So I usually discourage teachers from asking a lot of prediction questions and encourage them instead to focus a lot on pronoun reference inferences. Even though it seems so automatic to many of us, a lot of students really do struggle, and they don't stop themselves to ask, wait, who is that he, or especially with like more abstract reference like this or that, often refer to more abstract reference. And it's really useful for students to stop and ask themselves, wait, what does that refer to? So maybe that's my little teaser with inference instruction. I don't know if that was enough. And then with content, supporting comprehension in content area classrooms, I mean, the first and most important thing is that for really understandable reasons, a lot of content area teachers do not use text in their classroom. Students never read texts in some of their social studies and science classrooms. And it's really understandable. There's just so much content to convey. I have spent the most time in social studies classrooms or history classrooms. And so often teachers use PowerPoints to teach content, and students maybe are like taking notes in these little note-taking structures based on the PowerPoint, and they just never read. And so that's really important, is just making sure to communicate to all teachers that they really should also be teachers of reading, and that the only way that students are going to get better, are going to develop confidence as readers, is if they can be exposed to text across content areas. And then that vocabulary instruction piece, like I think if all content area teachers knew how to provide like explicit vocabulary instruction and lots of visual images, and talk about examples and non-examples, and really get at nuance and word meaning with students, that would be so wonderful.
And I think tonight too, you also talked about, that power of inferencing, but how dependent that is on someone's background knowledge, because that's what you're using to make that inference. So, the power of trying to build background knowledge is huge for reading comprehension.
For sure.
Yeah. All right. One question that just popped up, but you may have kind of referenced this, or what are some strategies to foster word consciousness?
Yeah, that's a good question. I do think that, you know, a lot of that is, you know, teacher modeling of word consciousness, right? And I think that just making words things that, you know, you talk a lot about in your classroom, and everyone's really curious about words and interested in discovering word meanings. It becomes sort of part of a classroom culture, right?
All right. Any other questions before we wrap up tonight's chat with Dr. Colby Hall? It's your last chance. Well, Dr. Hall, thank you so much. Thank you for sharing this information with us tonight, and also partnering with the Reading League of Virginia to bring this to everyone that's here tonight. And we know we have different stakeholders represented in our group tonight, and so we thank you for working with us. We also want everyone to check out our chat for our link to become a member of the Reading League of Virginia. We also want to take time to thank not only Dr. Hall, but and the board for all of their work in the Virginia chapter of the Reading League. But we'd also like to thank our sponsor, Zaner-Blosser. Donna Moody, who's a Reading League Virginia team member or board member and a Zaner-Blosser representative, has a little bit of great information to share with you.
Yes, thank you very much. We are very proud to be sponsoring the Reading League. Lots of good work happening out there and lots of good information being shared. Colby, thank you so much for all of your interesting words tonight. I think you gave some very good specific examples that people can go back and use tomorrow in their classroom. And I think that's what everybody's looking for. So thank you very much. It's funny that this was on vocabulary, because as you'll see on the screen, we're also sponsoring Laura Stewart in a 5-part webinar. She's the National Director of the Reading League, and she just did last night a session on vocabulary. So if you have not gone to the link in our chat yet to register for Laura's free webinars, do that now, and you'll get the recording of all 5. So even if you missed it, it's okay. You can go ahead and register and you'll get all 5 webinars. I'm actually having dinner with Laura tonight, Colby, and I'm going to tell her how much I enjoyed your session today. So again, thank you very much. I also wanted to say just a couple of things about materials that you use. Zaner-Blosser has a whole plethora of materials. What we do have for reading is the Super Kids Reading Program. That's a core program. If you're interested in that, I can certainly provide more information. Systematic, explicit phonics instruction, phonemic awareness, the right kind of stuff for the new science of reading era that we're in now. Also, we have foundational skills kits. That would be for someone that does not want a core program, but something to supplement with what you're using now and give you some kind of structure. So your teachers could have some systematic, explicit instruction in the foundational skills. We also have phonemic awareness sets now, as well as decodable libraries called reading resources. So I'd be happy if any of you all want to reach out to me, or if you go to our website, zaner-blosser.com, you can learn more about any of these. Thanks again.
Again, we want to thank, again, Dr. Hall. We want to also thank you for all, in the audience joining us tonight. We also want to let you know about an upcoming event with Lynn Stone. Spelling is a complex orthography, and that's going to be on January 12th at 5 p.m. So thank you. Before you sign off, please check that chat for links to become a member, and also some of the articles that were referenced tonight. The links are in there as well. Thank you, everyone.